We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Simpson Center Policy and Education Series. This is our third webinar in the series, sponsored by UFA and RCF. My name is Ellen Novinko. I'm also from the Simpson Center, and I'm really excited to be moderating today's discussion, talking about ag tech and the importance of on-farm experimentation. In this webinar today, we'll look at new technology for agriculture from an intellectual property perspective and the rising importance of on-farm experimentation. We'll look at questions like, have the rapid changes in technology kept pace with decisions made on-farm? Why or why not? And from a global competitive standpoint, is Canadian farming keeping up or falling behind? We'll also think about what can be commercialized and what makes more sense to protect, and how researchers and government can help industry access the right solutions for on-farm decisions. We have two very special speakers today. I am happy to be joined by Dr. Simon Cook. He's an adjunct professor at Murdoch University in Australia, and he's led a research team in Western Australia to develop the state's capabilities in big data and agriculture. We're also joined by Lorelei Graham, partner at Bennett Jones in Toronto, Canada, and she practices intellectual property law with a significant focus on clients in the food and agricultural and agribusiness sector. So we'll be using Zoom polls today, as we have in past webinars, to gauge interest and opinions on the topic. Participants will have about a minute to respond to the question. I really encourage everyone to use the Q&A throughout the webinar within Zoom to post questions, to upvote questions that people have already asked, and to see what questions and what topics and what opinions are being discussed. If time allows, after everyone has finished presenting, we should be able to go through the questions after the presentations. So that is just a little overview of our ground rules and the format. So we're going to kick it off now with our first Zoom poll. So you'll see a question pop up on your screen now, the first poll. And in your opinion, how would ag tech benefit on-farm production best? So you have three options, and we'll give you about a minute to vote. And the anxiously awaited results. It seems that we are thinking about labor and crops most, and we are also thinking a little bit less about animals. So how can ag tech directly benefit each of these different parts of on-farm sectors? So some interesting stuff. People are obviously thinking a lot more about what happens on a farm and the different parts of farm production. So thinking with that in mind, we're going to start with Dr. Simon Cook. He will be our first presenter today, and he's going to be talking about on-farm experimentation and what it means in Canada and Australia. So Simon.
Good morning, everyone. I say good morning because although I am representing Australia here at this great talk, I'm actually based to your south at the moment in Colombia. So life is very strange. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce some of the particular aspects of on-farm experimentation and why we developed it. I'm actually a professor in digital agriculture and was tasked with the challenge of trying to increase the level of adoption of digital technology amongst Australian farmers, and on-farm experimentation actually turned out to be an important part of that. I give this talk on behalf of my colleagues, Myrtille Lacoste. She's at Montpellier, but was with us in Western Australia. Matt McNee, who's still in Western Australia, and Nicholas Tremblay, who's with the International Society of Precision Agriculture and was formerly with Ag Canada. So they helped me a lot with some of the concepts developed. Yeah. So a quick outline, background. First of all, why Australia and Canada? What can Australia and Canada learn from one another? What I hope to do is just show a couple of slides to demonstrate why actually we have quite similar issues and problems. I want to go quickly through what we mean by on-farm experimentation. I come from a technology and science background, but we learned a lot that there's a lot more to it than just getting the technology to work. Why on-farm experimentation is actually an important part of the technology adoption process. And finally, just really a lead into Lorelei about what are some of the policy, legislative, and investment implications that we came across that may be of interest to you. So I'm not going to go through all of these, just a quick idea. This is some of the World Bank data to demonstrate the parallels between Australia and Canada. Australia is the yellow one, Canada is the red one. The light blue one is your neighbour to the south. The dark blue is the EU. So you can see Australia, in terms of GDP, is rapidly developing wealth nationally and has somewhat left agriculture behind in that. And has kept track with the US. The top right graph shows we're actually a high taxation economy, even more so than the EU. Canada is more like the US in that respect, but the bottom two graphs tend to demonstrate or reflect our politics. The red and the blue are together in that. And the Gini index, which is an index of inequality, we're both quite low inequality, much less unequal than the US, and in terms of the income shared by the bottom 20% of our societies, we're pretty similar there. In terms of agriculture, top left is the arable area per person, and you can see in Canada it's been declining as population has increased. In Australia it has not. We've actually expanded, if anything, but jerkily. In terms of cereal production, we're both much less than either the EU or the US, which is still increasing. We're increasing, but slowly. In terms of yield, in Australia, we've been struggling to increase yield for decades. It's a difficult climate. You've actually, surprisingly, seem to have increased your yield. Probably that is increases in maize, because it seems to be tracking the US increase. And bottom right is the fertilizer consumption. We're both relatively low consumers of fertilizer in terms of kilograms per hectare of arable land. In terms of change, well, cereals have been very important to both of our economies and our rural development history, but they appear to be getting less important. The actual growth of cereals in terms of value added, total value added dollars, both are growing, but slowly compared to the US or the EU. In terms of the proportion that we add to growth of GDP, we have both seen quite dramatic declines in importance of that as other areas have grown. In terms of employment, we have also both seen dramatic declines in the employment within agriculture. So interesting that Labour was number 2, not number 1 in the poll. And in terms of our exports, they were extremely important in the 70s, 80s, but these days it's kind of plateaued out at a relatively low level, around the 5% mark. Okay, so we both share some characteristics. First of all, we tend to think about cereals, they're important to us. And we're talking about export, particularly commodity exports. We both have relatively low yields, but large areas. and we both struggle with what you might call marginal production areas, trying to manage those. So we have intense learning requirements amongst our farmers. We're trying to look for change, and I think minerals taxes from mineral sectors may have bought us some time, but really we're looking to change the system a little bit more rapidly. In Australia, I would say we are changing rapidly, probably more rapidly than in Canada. Second big difference we have is that you have a much better soils than we do. You can't improve our soils, and our climates, because of climate change, are definitely deteriorating. So the area over which we can produce crops is actually becoming more and more unstable. In terms of subsidies or cross investment from mineral sectors, you have your oil. I don't know what's going to happen to that. We have our coal, but I can tell you that's definitely going to be less important than it has been in the past. So we're living in new times. We're looking at change in farming, and we think on-farm experimentation is an important part of that. First of all, let me clarify what I mean by on-farm experimentation. This is not a scientist's experiment put out on farm. These on-farm experiments that we talk about tend to be put out by farmers. They're instigated by them with scientists' help often, or advisors' help, but they're at scale, they're big, they're practical to answer practical learning issues, not theoretical scientist issues. We first got into on-farm experimentation with this, and if that picture looks a bit crusty, that's because it is. The bottom left-hand picture, where you might notice that's an air seeder. It's actually a Canadian air seeder, Morris air seeder, one of the first in Australia to be able to manage variable technology. And we got into that as a means of introducing precision agricultural technology. In other words, we thought, well, why not use the technology to install experiments at farmer scale, doing what farmers want and understanding what they see as the problems. And we got into this almost by accident way back in the 1990s. So the right-hand picture is actually a airborne video image of our first on-farm experimentation, which was 72 hectares, repeated nitrogen application, repeated about 200 times. We learned a lot from that. We thought we were being pretty revolutionary, but we learned that in actual fact, some of the ideas actually date back to the 80s and before that, through farming systems research and participatory research ideas, but they didn't have the technology that we had. So we're talking about a process whereby a social process of learning with farmers was put together with the technology process that Precision Ag gave us. And so we tried to move towards that philosophical change towards farmer-led research, but data-rich. This is what some of the results look like, pretty big. On the left-hand side is what the yield looks like. You can't see the results of the experiment in that. The results are typically on the right-hand side there. Often the results are quite small in terms of total treatment effects, but the variation of the treatment effects are often massive over scale. So you need to use the technology to work out what's going on. And we find that farmers actually understand these variations much better than many scientists. So we have some rules about this. The first rule is that keep it farmer-centric. In other words, work with farmers, try and work out what they want to do, not trying to twist their arms to do what you wanted to do. We say keep it simple, because if you're working at big scale, they always become complex pretty quickly. But we say try and keep it big, because that's the scale at which farmers understand these problems and how they're going to interpret them. They often interpret them at landscape scale. And in this image, you can see, because it's using a background from the Google Earth, you can see that the incredible effect of soils on the treatment responses, which are in green and red. Our fourth rule is to keep out of the way. We learned that there are times when you do not want to talk to farmers because they're just too busy. So you have to work with them with their management cycle. And the fifth rule we had is that don't expect the answer to pop out in the first cycle. You keep exploring, almost in the Taguchi philosophy, method of and continuous process control and improvement. So this is where we ended up, is that a process, what we call the racetrack process, which was both a social and technical process of engagement, analysis, and interpretation. And the circle keeps going up, keep going around. We're talking about continuous engagement here, not perpetual, but continuous, because it's about engagement of scientists or consultants with growers. Biggest problem we have is that is actually not convincing farmers or consultants. They like this stuff. The biggest problem we have is actually convincing scientists to work with us, because they frankly feel intimidated, I think, by the information that the technology provides. They want to stick in the top left of this diagram, which is to be sure about the semantic content of information. They don't know how to make the information relevant, but they like to quantify specific processes, not the whole system. On the other hand, farmers tend to work more in the bottom right part of things, where they don't exactly know why it's going on, but they think it makes practical sense to them, and they're able to operate and change their decisions on that basis. And we can talk at length about how you actually bridge those two ways of thinking about it. That's for another seminar, I think, but I'll just leave it at that. This is the scientific challenge, how to bridge those two ways of thinking. So in practical terms, you can think about how the sciences actually support things. So the analysis actually identifies some of the effects and explains it. Some economics identify why that's important, and the agronomy can actually convert pragmatic concepts into semantic ones, so that you can scale them up and you can apply those insights, share those insights elsewhere. The process, we started the process in the 90s. It's been growing much more rapidly over the last 10 or 15 years. And so we now have a network. These aren't of practitioners. These are of laboratories and research groups who are using OFE. And actually, it's been expanding a lot more since then. And on the right-hand side is a diagram from a paper we published in Nature last year, which I'd be happy to send to anyone if they're interested. Okay, so quick summary of that. There's quite a lot behind that, as you can imagine, but basically the summary is that we didn't plan this. We stumbled across on-farm experimentation as we were trying to work out how to use precision ag technology. And we learned that you must have farmer-centric change. We needed a process to increase the level of data in our process, and we learned that it's not a one-off package. It's actually a philosophy of continuous improvement. We learned too that there's actually a lot done on the social sciences about these processes, and we also learned that it's very tough to get change within the science community, because we're talking about truly interdisciplinary research. But the good news is we actually have a global network of practitioners now behind us that actually helps us do this. Why does this matter so much? Well, 3 reasons. First of all, it's an important part of the change process generally. Secondly, it's a pathway to get digital AgTech adoption amongst farmers and consultants that frankly have been failing in many ways otherwise. And the big one is that it's actually a type of change. Remember the first graphs I showed, it's a shift towards endogenous growth, that is truly building knowledge amongst farmers and consultants. What are the policy and research implications? Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that what OFE does, it increases the science content of farming. And here we have a classification of how industries actually adopt technologies. And this dates back to the 80s, but it's still very useful. And they make the difference between supplier dominated, where basically people adopt technologies just to improve production efficiencies. And that's where we were with precision agriculture. They don't actually improve the process necessarily, they just improve the way it's used. You can compare that with scale-dominated actors within value chains, and in agriculture, these would be typified by bulk handlers, grain bulk handlers, who integrate throughout the system and use technologies to improve their processes. You can think about specialist suppliers such as John Deere, who actually capture the IP in their product and actually use that to improve their value product. But really, the fourth one is the one that we want to aim towards. And what OFE does, it actually increases the opportunity to actually get it in towards science-based operations, where you really know much more about how the plant or animal is being managed within a complex environment. And that requires a lot of science knowledge to improve it. And that's an important step for on-farm experimentation. The second thing I'd just like to mention very briefly is the issue that I talked about was the call for interdisciplinary research. And this has investment, but also policy implications that we're finding it's very difficult to bridge across two disciplines. Lots of people will work in data sciences or agronomy, but very few like to work across those disciplines. Even fewer are prepared to bridge across all three disciplines. Researchers just don't like to do it. It's very difficult to get a grip of it. And so that's something that research policy can really help with. And the final point that I'd just like to raise is about the IP issue. We are finding in Australia that IP is a serious issue, but not a killer. Farmers and our highly developed farmers are happy to share data locally, but very unhappy to let the data go out beyond their control. So there's big issues about how they're going to share data and how they're going to get value from data and share the value amongst people that they know and get that full value. And so this farm data code was actually produced by the National Farmers Federation in Australia, and it mimics many of the issues that you'll find too within the EU data regulation. Just a very final point here is that it's not just with developed high-tech farmers that IP is an issue. It's also becoming an issue, and I'm doing work in Africa and Asia as well. There are issues of farmers' IP there as well. So it's not just amongst highly tech-driven farmers. So in summary, I'd say on-farm experiment is already established and it's growing. It is farmer friendly and therefore is likely to be adopted by farmers if you offer it. But researchers and many consultants, I have to say, do find it challenging to get across. I would say it is transformative, and for that reason, there are serious policy research and legislative implications that we need to know about. So great opportunity for this seminar. So thanks very much, Eleanor. Sorry if I overran a little bit. There's quite a lot to get through, but I hope you find that useful.
Yes, thank you so much. That was Dr. Simon Cook and his presentation, basically introducing and giving an overview on different applications of on-farm experimentation and how it plays into many different sciences, including social sciences. We're going to go into another poll now, again, just to see opinions and understand the audience's perspectives and what they find to be most relevant. In this question, we're going to be talking specifically about Alberta. So where do you see the biggest challenges for on-farm experimentations in Alberta? So you have different options. It's time, access to information, privacy concerns, or the learning curve associated with on-farm experimentation, which Simon kindly explained. So we'll give you about a minute to decide what you feel is going to be, or what you would see as the biggest challenge in Alberta. Okay, so some interesting results. Time was Time and the learning curve were by far the most popular answers, which is definitely interesting. I think it is something that would have to be considered, and a rollout would have to involve multiple years and thinking about gradual progression, and that would include the learning curve as well. So going from how can on-farm experimentation empower and reinforce farmers to learn from their own production operations, we are going to move into a little bit about what Simon was saying at the end about data and how data sharing can be a challenge when deciding on if on-farm experimentation and the use of ag tech is worthwhile on farms. So we're going to be talking with Lorelei Graham. She's going to be giving a presentation as ag tech startups, agribusinesses, and entrepreneurial initiatives within agriculture are booming. Different challenges and questions on data protection, privacy, and commercialization always come up. So Lorelei will be giving a presentation going over this and a few other topics and themes as well. So Lorelei, it's all on you.
Thanks so much, Elena. And thanks everybody for inviting me today. It's really great to be here. So I sort of wanted to start with a bit of background on where Canada is with their commitment to the ag tech sector. As most of you know, Canada's agri-food sector spans so many industries, including primary agriculture, aquaculture, food, beverage, processing, retailers, wholesalers, and service providers like myself. So the technology that is being developed and utilized to support these varied industries is really diverse. And typically ag tech will include AI, big data, sensors, IoT technologies, GPS systems, robotics, biotechnologies, and even bioinformatics. And the current trends in Canadian ag tech innovation are really focused on four main areas. So things, as Simon mentioned, with precision agriculture, controlled environment agriculture like greenhouses and vertical farming, sustainable food production, which is really sort of take front and center given climate change, the pandemic, and recent world events, and of course, ag biotech. So these trends to a certain extent are reflected in active Canadian ag tech companies. I've listed the main categories of where we are seeing the most growth in company formation and active innovation. Precision farming continues to see significant growth in soil and crop management and IoT infrastructure. And the other main areas of growth are in indoor farming, greenhouses, vertical farming, crop protection, nutrition inputs with chemical pesticides, fertilizers, and biostimulants. So some would say that this growth can be partially attributed to the government's commitment to agriculture through the Canadian Agriculture Partnership and Agri-Innovate, which is a program that has supported the acceleration of commercialization of innovative technologies in the ag space. Another program that will most likely assist Canada's commitment to the agriculture community is ISED's IP Elevate program that some might be familiar with. This program has earmarked $96 million for supporting innovation across a broad range of disciplines, not just agriculture to be clear, but it's through your national and regional innovation centers. And these funds can be used to help scaling companies actually pay for the execution of their IP strategies. So I think Canada's continuing focus in support of agriculture is also reflected partially in the amount of investment happening in the sector currently. Investment is always a critical piece for successful commercialization of innovation. And recent statistics show that in 2019, Canada was 7th globally in agri-food total dollar value of new investment deals, which is pretty good, and 6th in the world for new deals. Most of this innovation is happening across the country, with 33% happening in Ontario, 18% in BC, 17% in Alberta, 11% in Quebec, 10% in Saskatchewan, and 5% in Manitoba. What's interesting is that the majority of this innovation is happening at the SME level and not at the enterprise level. So I think that's an important thing to think about. So I guess the next question is given the amount of innovation happening in Canadian agri-tech sector, how can farm experimentation support this innovation? Sort of what are the issues? So participating in an OFE can have some real challenges like anything. And like any relationship, it's really important to have clear understanding between the parties from the very beginning. What's included in the stated purpose? What are the commitments? What are the obligations, the timing, and of course, any associated costs? I've also included trust and time as potential barriers or challenges. Regardless of the project, trust and time are typically critical issues for the parties, and you really have to have both to be successful. Prior to commencing any on-farm experiment, I really think it's important to conduct due diligence on the party prior to entering into any arrangement so that you have a thorough understanding of who you're dealing with. Sufficient due diligence can form the basis of long-term relationships and trust between the parties. And as we've already heard, time is an important factor from the innovator side and probably at a premium for producers. So if you have clear rules of engagement so that expectations are managed on all sides, this will really maximize the invested time by parties. I want to pause here just for a second on data. Data is unfortunately, as we've heard, still a challenge for the agricultural community, though it should be an opportunity for innovation and commercialization in my mind. And while IT innovation can increase efficiencies, as we've heard, lower costs, increase yields, improve management and decision-making, the data that flows out of that innovation is still at issue. And many parties, as we all know, are increasingly not comfortable with sharing their data outside their organizations. And unfortunately, the federal government is still in the process of addressing the rules around data. While Canada has developed the Digital Charter that some of you may be aware of, it has only recently tabled the Digital Charter Implementation Act, which will address data issues under the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, and the Personal Information and Data Protection Tribunal Act. And unfortunately, Canada also does not have any of the voluntary codes of conduct around data for the agricultural industry like they currently have in the US, New Zealand, and as Australia, as Simon mentioned. And so given the lack of guidance and rules around data, I once again recommend that regardless of what you're doing, that all parties have a clear understanding around data sharing and ownership of data that flows from a project so that everyone has clear direction on the data, and that will promote trust at all levels of the project. Similar to data is confidential information, which is really maybe a bit of a, it has a bigger umbrella of defined information, but it needs to still be clearly defined during the project so that all parties and their employees understand what can be shared and what cannot. Confidential information is really an important element to a party's commercialization strategy. This is true regardless of whether they're pursuing sort of formal IP protection or keeping their findings as a trade secret or confidential information. So despite some of these challenges, I think OFEs can provide a great collaboration platform or springboard in which primary producers can be a part of an innovation journey. This type of collaboration can be really instrumental as it can provide timely and really relevant feedback to the innovator. It also allows the innovator to make adjustments, pivot, or accelerate their innovation. And since time is always money, the sooner these potential changes or shifts can happen, the better for the commercialization strategy. What that could mean at the end of the day is it can mean a faster pathway to market, a redeployment of funds, or even going in a completely different direction. So depending on the structure of the collaboration and the project, involvement in OFE can really result in a producer being a significant part of the innovation. So this could mean maybe being named an inventor or even being part of a resulting commercialization entity. There could even be a potential opportunity for an alternative revenue stream from intellectual property or commercialization of the innovation. Another opportunity for increased OFE activity and associated data would be more on a macro scale. And what I mean by that is mainly moving towards implementing alternative data sharing and ownership models that would benefit the greater Canadian agricultural community and build trust. So I think increased OFE activity could be a catalyst for adopting, for instance, more of a cooperative governance structure around data, its collection and its use, and given and sort of allow it to be more accepted in the ag community. So I think it's an important part of the future for ag. I wanted to spend a minute or two on commercialization to highlight some of the drivers for commercialization that are definitely applicable to all aspects of the agricultural community, including collaborations with on-farm experimentation. So for any typical successful innovation commercialization, regardless of the industry, it really requires intention and a vision that everyone involved in the project buys into. And one also needs to understand how that vision maps to the business activities in projects like on-farm experiments. And that vision really becomes a company's innovation DNA or backbone. And developing innovation DNA requires sort of setting the table not only at the macro level or at the big picture of the business's direction, but also at the micro level, namely those projects that underpin your commercialization pathway, which can include on-farm experimentation. As such, you may need multiple strategies for the variety of projects that feed into your vision. What I think is important to acknowledge is that for the successful execution of these different strategies, and this includes in the ag sector, you may have to adopt business models and utilize different structures that you may not be familiar with. So I encourage people to think outside of the box and explore new ways to achieve your goals that will allow you to develop strong innovation DNA and sort of stay ahead of your competitors and not go down with the ship. And you can assist this type of analysis by asking questions like, what are the intellectual assets that you have? What do you need and what do you want? And how do all those assets map to your success? So for the successful practice of your business model and commercialization of your innovation, you may conclude that you need some help. And this is where collaboration with the right entity can be a real key to your success. And collaboration can happen, in a wide variety of forms, and picking that right partner is key to your success. And to be able to pick that right partner, you need to be able to sort of assess what is the purpose of the collaboration, sort of coming back to what do you have, what do you need, and what do you want, and then doing sort of the required scanning to find that right party to fit the purpose, work your strategy or model, and then therefore achieve your vision. And so once you have that right party, you can sort of follow the process I outlined earlier on due diligence and rules of engagement, so that everyone has, everyone is clear on the expectations of the project. Finally, depending on the collaboration, you should ensure that you have the right infrastructure to execute your side of the collaboration and onboard the resulting data and or intellectual assets effectively so that you add value to the business. This might include ensuring that you have the right data governance model or policies and your ability to properly protect registrable IP. You might even consider a benchmarking analysis, both pre and post collaboration, to ensure that you're satisfied with this type of collaboration and your partner and your return on investment. So protecting your innovation really depends on what it is you're trying to protect. So the subject matter of the innovation. You should also consider what is the potential value of the innovation to the business to determine whether it makes sense even to seek formal protection. And as intangible assets and IP can come about in different ways, understanding your options around the different mechanisms of intellectual property protection can help you make sort of timely and relevant decisions that further your commercialization and innovation journey. So I've set out on the slide sort of the main types of intellectual property mechanisms that are typically found in agri-tech innovation. We unfortunately don't have enough time sort of to delve into all the relevant aspects of each one, but I wanted to provide a few quick comments on each one. So patents are often considered one of the strongest forms of protection. They're jurisdictionally based. They provide a monopoly for 20 years from the earliest filing dates and have strict disclosure rules and timelines. They can be used to protect a wide variety of subject matter that I've listed here, but must meet 3 requirements. And those are that the subject matter must have utility or must be useful. It must be novel in that no one's practicing an identical invention, and it must be inventive over other similar inventions. Trademarks, as I'm sure many of you know, can protect a brand in its various formats that I've listed, and that brand has to be associated with specific goods and or services. Trademarks are also jurisdictionally based. However, they can last indefinitely if renewed and have no disclosure concerns. Critical rules around trademarks would include making sure your mark is not confusingly similar to another third-party brand that is in a similar channel of trade, or that your mark is not descriptive of what you are associating with. Another formal right are plant breeders' rights, which are granted for 25 years for a tree or vine variety and 20 years for all other varieties of plants, but excludes algae, bacteria, and fungi. The holder has a number of exclusive rights, including the right to produce, reproduce, sell, and export propagating material of the variety. So in contrast to sort of registrable rights like patents and trademarks, trade secrets do not require any formal registration, but they do require the corporation to adopt internal procedures to keep the relevant information actually secret. Typical trade secret subject matter is often confidential information that is industrial, has some sort of industrial commercial value. There are a number of ways to keep a trade secret secret. For instance, you can use non-disclosure or confidentiality agreements, encryption, password protection of digital information, or even traditional lock and key. Confidential information should also be identified and subject to increased security measures. Confidential information can include things like data, client and customer lists, and marketing strategies. Wherever possible, we always recommend NDAs or definitive agreements in place around all types of confidential information. So ownership. Ownership considerations of intangible assets, including data, really depends on what is the intangible or intellectual asset. Ownership is often dictated by previous sort of defined contractual obligations. So it's important, again, once again, to understand sort of your rights prior to entering into any agreement. For example, an independent contractor agreement typically transfers all intellectual property rights from the independent contractor to the entity in exchange for compensation. Intellectual property that is developed for and during an employment situation is owned by the employer and is usually set out in employment contracts. Non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements can also have clauses that deal with ownership of IP and data through residual and feedback provisions. So it's really important to review these agreements very carefully. Collaboration and joint development agreements, as I mentioned above, can provide for bespoke ownership arrangements for intellectual property and data. And the provisions can dictate ownership of the background IP, which is what each party brings to the collaboration, and then who owns the IP that or data that is developed during the collaboration or foreground IP. You may have also come across assignment agreements, especially in research situations. These agreements are often a straight transfer of rights from the researcher to the institution and typically include obligations if there are patent filings involved, so you need to be aware of that. With respect to co-ownership of intellectual property, we usually discourage this approach as it has some logistical challenges. There's often increased costs, often limits on the ability to exploit the invention, and often discourages investment in an entity. Sort of a final note on ownership is to highlight that given the complexity of some collaborations and working arrangements, it's really important to make sure that all relevant agreements work together and there's a clear understanding of everyone's rights and obligations. So the goal for almost every innovation commercialization journey is to have that innovation be adopted. And compared to other countries, Canadian agricultural stakeholders have been slower to adopt new technologies in general. And while Canada clearly has great agricultural focused innovation, we're not adopting these technologies within Canada as quickly as other foreign agricultural communities, for instance, like in the Netherlands. And so on this slide, I've listed a number of barriers that the agricultural community has identified as potential reasons for the lack of adoption. And we've also sort of seen that in the poll today. And I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with some, if not all of these. And unfortunately, there are no quick and easy solutions to most of these barriers. However, I would like to mention sort of in conclusion that in my opinion, a well-designed collaboration with the caveats I've mentioned allows for engagement by all parties and can be a driver of adoption for agritech in Canada. I also think that on-farm experimentation is a great example of how effective the right kind of collaboration can be. It allows for timely and relevant feedback to the innovator, which is valuable, and that in turn enables innovation to move forward at a faster rate. This can, I think, ultimately promote the adoption of AgTech, and that adoption will have been based on community engagement. And then this ultimately builds trust and brings down some of these barriers. So that's all I have for now until we can have some questions and sort of go from there.
Yes, thank you so much, Lorelei. That was a great kind of primer and gave a lot of really, really valuable information. So I'm looking at the questions now, and there seems to be, it exploded the last like 10 minutes. We got heaps of questions the last 10 minutes. I'm looking at the questions now, and there seems to be two main topics. The first being funding, and the second being cooperatives and how we can better build up cooperatives in order to increase data sharing at a local level. So I think the first question that I'll ask, kind of trying to synthesize some of these together, is based on the funding, how can we determine, or how do certain farms qualify for funding? So Lorelei, you mentioned that 33%, I think you said, of funding goes to Ontario, despite, you know, most agriculture coming from Alberta and Saskatchewan. And Simon, it seems that a lot of funding is happening, or a lot of agricultural output is coming from Victoria in Australia. So how is it determined where the funding goes, and how can farmers better improve their chances to get funding?
Can I address this?
Lorelei or Simon, yeah.
Can I, first of all, we don't, of course, funding is always nice for researchers, but we were working on business models that didn't rely on external sources of funding. And we did that because I don't know how many farmers actually experiment now in Canada, but we found in Western Australia that in actual fact, 83% of farmers already experiment. In other words, the vast majority of farmers use experimentation as a form of developing their cognition about their own process. So they're ready to do it. We explored a range of different cost structures for OFE, going from semi-automatic processes, and these are being offered now by commercial companies that are very cheap, but have virtually no human engagement, and so aren't always that easy to interpret, through to the full research models that will need external funding. And what we were most interested in were the ones in the middle that are cheap enough for farmers to install anyway. That's why we do big ones. They use conventional machinery to install them. they can install them anyway. If you start this, but what you need somebody to intermediate. And we had 4 different types of models, starting with a supplier model. So for the one that was quite successful was a fertilizer supplier, undertook to support the farmer in their installation and interpretation of large experiments. And you might say, well, surely the fertilizer supplier has a reason for not doing it well because they want to sell more fertilizer. I actually asked this of our partner, and they said, we don't care if the experiment suggests that the client should buy less fertilizer, because they're spending so much money with us. We want to keep them. We have $1 million clients and we want to keep them. So that was one business model. There's another one that you could think of a service provider actually charging for the service, but either for land valuation or for agronomic consultancy, or even accountants or banks could actually use this process to get a good grip on valuation. They all hinge on creating value from the information and sharing value between the farmer and the service provider. But there are several business models, and I saw Lewis's questions. I thought they were very good questions. If you want to put us in touch, happy to follow up if that helps. All right, Eleanor, sorry.
So I'll just add, I think, just as a clarification. So the way it's not that Ontario got 33%. It's more who was uptaking of the funds available through these different programs. And I think that's where one of the themes we talked about a little bit earlier, prior to having this webinar, was communication, right? So communication, Canada is such a large country, communicating about programs, what's available for funding. And most of this funding is based on some kind of business proposal that you have, however you're defining that collaboration, that then accesses the funds at different levels. And the most recent one, as I mentioned, for ISED, is really sort of a bit of a game changer that the federal government across all sort of industries, not just ag, has decided to put their money where their mouth is and support small Canadian innovation or SME level, innovation, to actually get them the cash to pay for their patents, pay for their legal fees, pay for their consulting fees, to actually help them execute. And that's a shift for sure. So I give the government huge props for that. The money has not been awarded yet, to be absolutely clear, but I would be shocked if the agricultural community didn't get a shot at that. And that's going to be doled out at regional levels. So if you're in Alberta, you're going to have access to that. You need to get in touch with your regional innovation centers, and whoever you're working with or who you want to work with, let them be aware of those sort of pots of monies. And there's always pots of money sort of opening up for different things. But I think it's critical, depending how you're doing this. And Simon gave his talk was excellent just on the scope and scale of what can happen if we do this. And I think if we do more of it, sort of to lead into the other question, we could then sort of start to move the needle on ag tech in Canada and its adoption. And obviously data flows out of a lot of this adoption, and it ties into sort of how do we want to have ownership around data? How do we want to share data? How do we want to be collaborative and be open with it? At the same time, balancing it with the fact that there are proprietary aspects to some of this. People work hard to innovate around things, but the partnerships that can happen and sort of the benefits around it could really change how Canada looks at agriculture technology, and sort of increase its adoption, and sort of deal then with the pressures of what's coming down the pipeline with climate change and everything else. So it is very integrated in an organic, unfortunately interdependent. In my mind, it's an interdependent solution, but a cooperative model is something that the agricultural community is familiar with. It back when the superclusters, I'm sure some people are familiar with, sort of started out with that. There were models presented around that for some of those superclusters to sort of think about sharing of data, being more collaborative, being more engaged, and getting that communication in the country happening more. So I'll pause there as I tend to ramble. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Simon, do you have any comments on that? There's definitely a lot of, I'm cognizant of the time. We only have about 2 minutes left, but I think that that's a great point, Lorelai. Really getting engaged and looking into your regional innovation options, I think is a great platform to start, just as a starting point in terms of collaboration, especially at the cooperative and the local level.
Two very quick comments, Eleanor. First was that we didn't see as government funding as being the driver of this. They might stimulate some things, but I know of one project that $25 million of government money, and it'll just be the tip of the iceberg, to be honest. It's going to be very small compared to the overall change, and they already have quite large sign-in by growers. The second point was actually a question to Lorelei. I didn't see in your list of IP instruments an instrument that would reward a farmer or their partner for the knowledge that they would create through OFE. And so I wonder if that's something that could be developed.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the instruments that I sort of set out there, they're the registrable kind, similar to what you have in Australia. And really that other intangible aspect that falls under trade secrets or confidential information. And that kind of sort of intellectual asset or intangible asset that would come out of an OFE that the farmers would be involved in. Really, that's where the collaboration agreement, and I hate to be the typical lawyer saying paper, because I don't want to create a barrier, but I do think there has to be an understanding. So what's yours, what's mine, what's ours? How are we going to commercialize it? Is there any point? Like, one of the things I'm also not a big fan of is just, filing patents and, spending legal fees and taking up a lot of people's time on things that really are not going to be any sort of, I'm going to say, has any commercial potential. So you want to have that sort of understanding, and that's where, discussion, engagement on what is the purpose, what are we trying to achieve, what do we have, what do we want, and what do we need, right? They're all sort of different questions with slightly, depending on which side of the table you're coming at, you're gonna have slightly different answers to some of those questions and be on slightly different side of the table. But if you can give some advantage, economic advantage to the farmer to engage, however he wants to, like, that's the other thing. Some people have no interest and other people really do. And once again, it depends on the technology that we're talking about, right? Some technologies are faster to market than others, and it makes more sense to get engaged and be involved in early days. And sometimes it's such a long haul, it's not worth it, right? So unfortunately, some of this is pure contract law, which is not as fun as some of the other stuff, but you can usually find something you can come to terms on. And like I said, as long as there's clear sort of papering of the file so that people know exactly what it is that they're doing and they're getting out of the bargain, you should be able to move forward.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. I'm going to cut everyone off there because we are at our time. It's 11 o'clock on the minute, on the dot right now. I want to thank you both so much for the presentations and the discussion. I think it was really, really interesting and gave a lot of people a lot to think about. And yes, we will hopefully be able to continue this discussion another time, perhaps in another webinar. The series continues. And yes, thank you again so much for attending and taking part. And we hope to see everyone who asked questions, and thank you, everyone who asked questions as well, all the participants in the audience. And we hope to see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you very much.